Going to go ahead and move on to our final presenter for this last session. This is Frabcesco P. Cioffo, and if I pronounced that wrong, please correct me. He holds a BA in history from Royal Holloway University of London. In 2017, he earned an MA in world history from King's College London, and in 2019, he obtained an MA in Japanese studies from SOAS. He is currently a PhD student at the University of Turin, Lungo d'Oro, Siena, where he is researching lesser-known spaces of Indo-Japanese interactions, such as industrial workshops, classrooms, and factories. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen. Yeah, okay. Is it visible? Everything all right?
Yes.
Okay. So, I mean, first of all, I'll start with the usual thank you for inviting me, because this, of course, is a very interesting conference, and I'm honored to be following like so many interesting scholars and papers. So, as you can see, this is the title of my paper, and it's the Mikado's Chemist, Puran Singh's education and his contribution to science. Now, this is more or less the structure of the paper. And since I've kind of explored the first part in other conferences, I'll try to be as brief as possible on the part one, and then try to discuss more in part two and part three. And I hope to be able to expand some of the issues with the Q&A if possible. So I'll start right in. Okay. So between the late 1890s and the early 1920s, hundreds of students, if not thousands, from India overcame cultural and imperial barriers to go to study scientific and technological subjects in Japan. They did so for several reasons. At times, this was just simply a cheaper option than Germany, England, or the United States of America. But for others, Japan was a choice made despite language barriers, obstacles of bureaucratic nature created by both the British Indian and the Japanese government. For a whole generation, born around the last quarter of the 19th century, then Japan came to signify a powerful example of Asian modernity. Among the people who felt about Japan in such a way was Puran Singh, and perhaps no one has expressed so eloquently as Puran Singh his love for Japan. And for those who might not be aware of Punjabi literature, I think it's enough to say that Puran Singh was a very complex personality, which cannot be easily be bracketed in one category. He was a holy man. He was a poet, a translator, an hagiographer, but most of all, he was a man of science. In 1989, his community of Rawalpindi, which is in the Punjab, gathered funds to send him and another students to Japan. He returned then in India in 1904, and soon he was appointed as to the position that would define much of his lifetime, and that is the imperial chemist at the Forestry Research Institute in Dehradun. Now, as I've shown here before, this paper essentially argues that by the end of the 19th century and the first 2 decades of the 20th century, Japan occupied a significant position as a model of alternative modernity within the geographical imaginaries and the global networks of travel established by the Swadeshi movement. I've decided to use Puran Singh for 3 main reasons, and that is that Puran Singh, first of all, has left an unusual amount of a paper trail. And that is the fact that he not only wrote his own autobiography, but he also his life was recorded by other biographical accounts of people who actually met him at the time. So this is a rather unusual thing, and I found this a unique opportunity to make my argument. Secondly, Puran Singh offers us a chance to analyze the pre-1905 moment, and that is the pre-Russo-Japanese War, which I would argue is the first major spike in terms of the circulation of people between South Asia and Japan, at least in the modern world, like in the 20th century. And the spike, of course, has been recognized in many papers and books, so I'm not going to dwell on that. But I think there is a point here to make, and that is the fact that we need to understand that the 1905 moment did not happen out of thin air. And we need to understand that actually there were structures and networks, both economic and political, that enabled this spike of mobility to happen. So using Puran Singh as a prism, I think it's a perfect example to see how these networks came into being. And thirdly, I think that Puran Singh's life pretty much he epitomized the life and trajectory of many other Indian students who came to Japan before and after him. Like many others, his trip was the result of the emergence of a transimperial of new kinds of transimperial financial and political networks. And I would argue these networks were fostered by what Manjabra has called as Swadeshi knowledge internationalism, and that is the desire to seek alternative circuits of knowledge production beyond the British Empire. So Puran Singh is kind of like epitomizes the life of the Japan returned Indians, which were trained in Japan and then they returned to work with the princely states, with imperial institution, or they start their own factories. Now, the first question that I want to explore then is how exactly did Indian students go to Japan in the first place? And I think, again, there's a lot to be said here, but I think that the most important points to be made here is that towards the end of the 19th century, the revolution in in the long distance travel and communication brought a new kind of interest in South Asia about Japan. But this was a kind of like a mix of global phenomenon and also local phenomenon. And I think in this time, three major systems of fundings actually came to be in South Asia to enable Indian students to go in Japan. And the first article and the first system was based essentially in the grassroots effort of local notables and wealthy families, such as is the case of Puran Singh. And they often gave to students loans, of course, with the idea that once they would be finishing their education, they would go back home and provide jobs and new industries for the local communities. Of course, this kind of networks did not happen by themselves. There was a whole system behind it of educators and political connections that were able to negotiate also the travels from Punjab all the way to Japan. The second networks of scholarships that emerged was that of like associations and especially those based, like mostly those of political association and the industrial / businessman association. And perhaps the most famous example of this kind is the association for the advancement of scientific and industrial education of Indians, which, especially in the period after the Russo-Japanese War, was the association that mostly provided funds for hundreds of students, as well as education in English, in the Japanese language, prior to their arrival in Japan. Now, and thirdly, and I think this is perhaps my most favorite one, at least the one that I found most interesting, is the fact that princely states and the heads of this princely state came to provide finances, funds and loans to students. And this is the case especially for the first recorded student in Japan, Mr. K.D. Kulkarni, who was who received funds. Well, he applied to receive funds first from the Maharaja of Baroda, but then ultimately managed to receive funds from the Darbar of Kolhapur. Now, there's a lot more to be said here, but I think that In the case of Puran Singh, here we see how the way in which Indian students reached Japan was not just by a singular will, but by the end of the 1880s, a whole system of political, economic, and financial support was able to allow Indians to actually go in Japan. But then I would say that the second question that I want to address here is, how did Japan actually, or like how the experience of the Puran Singh in Japan actually shaped it? And I think that overall, as a main point here to be made, I think that the experience of traveling and studying in Japan was a moment of radicalization for many Indians who actually managed to escape both the physical boundaries of surveillance and the more ephemeral circuits of knowledge production. And they were actually able to find in Japan a fertile environment to both find new knowledge, but also making new kind of intra-Asian networks of exchange and collaboration. So while in 1900, Puran Singh left India as a Sikh student who was like of good reputation, actually when he returned back from Japan, he became back as a Buddhist monk with a degree in industrial chemistry, ready to contribute both spiritually and politically to the advancement of India. And I think here the most important, I think like so far in the literature, the experience of the Puran Singh has been analyzed, especially in terms of his interactions with the Indian community in Japan. And I think that looking at the numbers of the Indian community in Japan, especially in the first kind of batch, as well as the post-1905 batch of Indian students, we see that students coming to Japan were located actually all over the country. Of course, there was a major focus in Tokyo as the capital, and also the place where more industries and more universities were available. But overall, Indians who arrived in Japan were able to go all in many cities, from Osaka to Kyoto and Kobe, as well as Sapporo, applying and studying to several kinds of factories and workshops, such as rubber making or glass making, and so on and so forth. But I think there is one aspect in his experience in Japan that has been kind of understudied, and that is the influence that his mentor Nagayoshi had on him. As Bartholomew has pointed out while discussing the first generation of Japanese scientists who studied abroad in the second half of the 19th century, for them, one of the key issues was the relationship between the students and their mentors, which did not only shape research, but also students, their whole conception of science and society. And I think in this case, the influence of Nagayoshi cannot be simply underestimated. He was the son of a physician from the Tosa domain, and he first began his career studying Dutch studies, but then soon moved first in Tokyo and then to Germany to study medicine and chemistry. I think, first of all, the association of Nagai with the Puran Singh was useful in the first instance as a way for Puran Singh to access academic circles, which would prove to be useful in his academic and in his working life beyond Japan. While his relationship with Nagai is not really completely clear, as Jaswinder Singh has shown, in the Puran's profile in the London Chemical Society, he is identified as a late research scholar of Dr. Nagai. Furthermore, even after his return in Japan, back to India, Puran Singh signed his early scientific articles and his journal in the Forest Research Institute's Indian Forest Memoirs, as a member of the chemical and pharmaceutical societies of Japan. And it is not too far-fetched to assume that he was the first ever Indian to actually join this society. And Nagai was actually the president of the pharmaceutical, was the first president of the pharmaceutical society, which I would argue must have had a great impact on the fact that the Puran was able to access this kind of institutions. And Puran, unlike most Indian students of the time, was always interacting with a plethora of students, scholars, and journalists and artists located around Tokyo, and especially around the University of Tokyo. Now, secondly, Nagai helped Puran Singh accessing specialized jobs, workshops, and training opportunities. After his time at the medical college at the University of Tokyo, Puran worked in Japan for almost a year by himself. In 1904, for instance, he worked at the Osaka Pharmaceutical Works, which was a private company financially backed by a conglomerate of Japanese businessmen who had just acquired the Nippon Chemicals of Osaka. One of the earliest state ventures in chemical production, which was actually funded by Professor Nagai in the late 1880s with the support of the Meiji government. Even after the acquisition of this company, Nagai was still involved in the new company as part of the management group in the guise of a supervisor. And Puran had the privilege to work in the Osaka Pharmaceutical Works, as well as in many other factories and workshops. And I think that the access to Nagayoshi must be emphasized here, because while there was also a degree of the collaboration between the Indian students and the academic community, the fact that Puran was so close to Nagai made him actually a unique example of this kind of interactions. Now, lastly, I think that the impact of Nagai can also be measured by the way in which their philosophies echoed with each other. And I think that especially in the case in which Nagai stressed the importance on finding a practical use to science, especially in support of local industries and their area of origins. So this attention upon the business side of industrial research and the desire to offer something back to the community were coherent also with the precepts of Swadeshi and the later experience of Puran Singh's working life in India. Between 1904 and 1931, before his death, Puran explored several types of employment, from the Maharajas to the Punjabi capitalists, as well as the British. So finally, I would like to answer the last question. How did Puran Singh actually contribute to science? And I think here in the literature, there are many discussions about this, and there is actually a lot of traces about his contribution to science that can be seen in the more than 50 articles published throughout his life, or the innovative techniques that he introduced. But I think my argument here is that perhaps the most important contribution that he made into science, which was related to Japan, was his the testimony that he gave to the Indian Industrial Commission in 1916. And I think this is important here to highlight, because the testimony that he gave to the commission was, first of all, based upon three main points. Number one, the principles underlining the successful industrial development of Japan. Number two, the defects of the system, like the current of research and industrial development in India. And three, more the suggestions for the future development of industries and organization of scientific research. Now, the Indian Industrial Commission came to be in the wake of the First World War, which had exposed two main issues. Number one, the fact that that India was over-reliant on imports of key commodities such as medicine and dyes. And secondly, that Japan had started to dangerously penetrate the Indian market. For instance, in 1960, Dorabji Tata, who was actually one of the members of the commission, authored in the Indian Review a paper against the, and I quote, the Japanese industrial invasion, end of quote. So while this commission was not directed directly against Japan, it was actually seen as one of the major efforts by the British official to listen to the Indian nationalist discourse that had been going on in the previous 2 decades, which had actually praised Japan industrialization. Furthermore, apart from the Puran Singh, Japan was a certain part also of another member of the commission, and that was Madan Mohan Malaviya. Although, again, here I don't have the time to explore that. Coupled with this kind of commission reports, there was also, of course, the 1905 volume on the educational system of Japan, written by W.H. Sharp, which could be argued there was, again, another case of the British Empire trying to use Japan for a model of reforms for India.
Please.
Yes. So eventually, what actually the contribution that he actually made during his witness, during his testimony to the commission, was that essentially Japan had to follow the example that India had to follow the example of Japan, especially in setting up industrialization from beginning with import of machinery and expertise, not only from Britain, but from all over the world. And this kind of selection was to be made, following expressly the Japanese model. And I think that furthermore, more of his recommendation were essentially related to the fact that expertise should be given priority in this kind of movements of industrialization, and then a kind of bureaucratic or bureaucratic perspective on industrialization would only slow down the whole process. Now, to conclude pretty much, although unfortunately I think I should have had more time, but that's okay for this time. I think that essentially the life of Puran Singh has proven that Japan was a model for Indians beyond the classical understanding of just vague and empty discourses. I think there were several projects which helped Japan more as an example, which tried to translate into concrete plans and idealization. Thank you for listening.
Are there any questions for this speaker?
Thank you, Professor. What I'm actually really interested in is actually the fact that you mentioned that Indian students were going to Japan for scientific studies. And this is a period when there was a shift away from going to British universities, going to Europe, especially to Germany, for pharmaceuticals and chemical and this kind of research, because Swiss and German laboratories and universities were well known. I'm just trying to understand how advanced was Japan in this field at that point in time, the 1880s, which you talk about, 1880s, 1890s.
Yeah, so actually, Nagai, I think, is the best person to locate this kind of development. And when Puran Singh arrives in Japan in 1900s, Nagai had arrived as a professor in chemistry in the University of Tokyo only for less than 5 years. I think we're talking about the first wave of, or the second generation of students that would go to study abroad and then come back to teaching actually the Japanese especially. So I would say, apart from the first initial kind of attempts to study, to kind of like set up a kind of like state-led factories, as the Osaka pharmaceutical work would actually point out. I think the state at that point was really early on. Like there was still mainly based on the German chemistry. Like there was especially in the field of like the pharmaceutical chemistry especially, I think by that point there was not a lot done, especially when Puran Singh arrives in Japan. Then of course this would change, I think, in a decade or so, but at that point, yeah, that would be the situation.
Okay, just another related question, just out of interest, is was Japan following the German model in the connection between universities and industry?
I think I would need to double check that, but there was kind of like with the Nagai that there was the first kind of attempt to establish this kind of connections.
Okay.
So like I think before him there wasn't really much that I know at least there wasn't really much happening at the time, but we're talking here really of the first stages as well. Like while Indians were going there, I think what is interesting about this is that they go there and they actually experience those first moments. Like they actually experience that kind of emerging, like emergence of like a Japanese science, if you want to call it like that, or like a Japanese understanding of science.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Professor.
It's your tea.
Just two quick comments. Number one, the Forest Research Institute is an interesting place because many of the revolutionaries, they got chemicals from Forest Research Institute. So there was a connection of the revolutionaries with Forest Research Institute that might have influenced Puran Singh. Number two, about the other question, very quickly, Japan during the initial periods of modernization of education very selectively sent students abroad for chemical sciences because chemical industry had to answer Germany. For shipbuilding and that kind of engineering, Britain. So they had a very selective policy of sending students to countries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you